The air in the Fulton County courtroom was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of old varnish and cheap coffee. I sat alone on the hard wooden bench. Across the aisle, they sat together. My son, Marcus Vance Jr., and his father's mistress, Monique Cross. They were smiling, confident. Monique even leaned over to whisper something in my son's ear, and he chuckled. They sat there like royalty, bathed in the dusty sunlight, believing the gavel was about to fall in their favor. They thought the will was the end of the story. They thought that because my husband, Marcus Sr., had signed a piece of paper, they had successfully erased my 40 years. They did not know this was not about the will. They did not know I was about to expose the crime that paid for their laughter. Before I go on, I just want to thank you for being here and listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please tap like, subscribe, and rate this story from 0 to 10. Tell me where you're listening from, too. I love knowing how far my truth can travel. It all began 2 months earlier, at my husband's funeral. The late autumn wind whipped across the steps of the chapel in Buckhead. It was a cold, gray Atlanta day that matched the numbness in my chest. I stood at the entrance, wearing a charcoal gray wool coat, his favorite. My fingers were stiff, but I forced a smile for every guest who murmured their condolences. He was a good man, Eleonora, a pillar of the community. I nodded, maintaining the dignified facade Marcus Sr. had always cared so much about. Even in his death, I was managing his reputation. I was performing the duties of the grieving widow, a role I thought was mine to play. Inside, the chapel was filled with white lilies, their scent overwhelmingly sweet. I sat in the front row, but I felt invisible. My son, Marcus Jr., walked to the podium. He looked sharp in his dark suit, the one I had helped him pick out. He is our only child, a successful engineer. He cleared his throat and began his eulogy, his voice steady. He spoke of his father's strength, his vision as an architect, his legacy in the city of Atlanta. I clutched my handbag in my lap, my knuckles turning white. I waited for him to say my name. I waited for the acknowledgement of the 40 years I had poured into that legacy, the career I sacrificed to build his. He paused, his eyes scanning the pews. "There is someone I want to give a special thank you to," Marcus Jr. said, his voice catching with emotion. The room fell silent. I held my breath. Someone who truly supported my father through the toughest times of his life. Someone who was true family to us. He was not looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the woman sitting 2 seats down from me, Miss Monique Cross. A soft murmur rippled through the chapel. Monique, his father's administrative assistant, dabbed her eyes with a delicate handkerchief. She wore a fitted emerald green dress, her makeup flawless. She looked more like the widow than I did. I felt the sound in the room detonate into silence. I knew the name, of course. She was the protégée Marcus Sr. had promoted so quickly, the one he always said I was paranoid about. From across the room, someone whispered, "She is sitting so close, like she belongs there." And my son, had just validated it. He had just redrawn our family portrait in front of everyone, and he had painted me out of the frame. I felt the floor drop from under me. People came up afterward, shaking my hand, their eyes filled with pity. I nodded, a machine repeating program responses. Then I saw Monique approach my son. She embraced him, a long, intimate hug. She pulled back and looked directly at me, over Marcus Jr.'s shoulder. Her eyes were not filled with grief. They were cold, assessing. She gave me a small, polite nod. It was not a gesture of sympathy. It was the acknowledgement of a victor. And in that moment, I knew this was not a tragedy. It was a coup. That night, the big Buckhead house was silent. The mourners were gone. The scent of lilies had been replaced by the stale smell of uneaten casserole dishes left by neighbors. I stood in the grand foyer, the one Marcus Sr. had designed to impress his clients. The high ceiling seemed to swallow the light, casting long, cold shadows. I was completely alone. Marcus Jr. had not come home with me. He had whispered that he was taking Monique home to make sure she was all right. I walked into the study, his study. Oak shelves lined the walls, filled with architectural awards and leather-bound books he had never read. This room was his stage, and I had been his stage manager for 40 years. I was not always just Mrs. Vance. Before I was a wife, I was Eleanora Hayes, one of the sharpest financial consultants at a downtown Atlanta firm. I had my own career, my own ambitions. I met Marcus Sr. at a city planning gala. He had the vision, I had the financial acumen. "We would be unstoppable, Ella," he had said, his voice smooth as velvet. "I will build the legacy, and you will make sure it lasts." So I quit my job. I poured my expertise into his fledgling architecture firm, Vance Designs. I balanced his books, managed his investments, and secured the loans that got him through the early lean years. I built the foundation, and he built his empire on top of it. I did it all while raising Marcus Jr., while hosting the dinner parties, while choosing the right charities to support his image. I became the silent partner, the invisible infrastructure that held his entire world together. I had believed I was building our legacy. I sank into his expensive leather chair. It still held the faint scent of his cologne and cigars. The police report was on the desk. I had barely glanced at it until now. Sudden car accident. He was driving downtown in that heavy morning rain. The brakes failed on a curve. The officer had said gently, "The car went into an embankment. He was gone quickly, ma'am." He did not suffer. At the time, I had accepted it as a tragedy, a sudden, cruel twist of fate. But now, sitting in that cold, silent house, Monique's triumphant nod flashing in my mind, a different thought surfaced. A car crash, failed brakes. It was also clean. I looked at the report again. He was not driving his usual sedan. He was in the vintage convertible, the one he kept meticulously serviced, the one he never ever drove in the rain. Why was he driving that car? And where was he going so early, in a storm? I felt a chill creep up my spine that had nothing to do with the empty house. I looked around the room, at the awards, the photos of him shaking hands with mayors, the curated image of Marcus Vance Sr. I realized I was not grieving the man I loved. I was grieving the man I thought I knew. The house was no longer my home. It was a museum dedicated to a life I was not sure I had ever truly lived. I was a ghost, haunting the set of another woman's story. And the man I had mourned all day? He was a stranger. The next morning, I sat in a conference room at a law firm I did not recognize. It was not our longtime family attorney. This office was downtown, in a dusty building with slow elevators. The air in the room was stale, smelling of old paper and lukewarm coffee. A faded print of the Atlanta skyline hung crookedly on the wall. I sat at one end of the long mahogany table. At the other end sat Marcus Jr., and right beside him, as if she had every right to be there, was Monique Cross. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back. She looked the part of the grieving employee, but her eyes were sharp. My son stared at a legal pad in front of him, his face a cold, unreadable mask. He had not said a word to me since we arrived. The lawyer, a man named Henderson with a tired face and gravy-stained tie, cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses and picked up the thick document. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Mr. Marcus Vance Sr.," he began, his voice a dull monotone. My hands were folded in my lap. I just wanted this to be over. I wanted to go home, even if home felt like a stranger's house, and grieve. "I will skip the preliminaries and proceed to the disposition of assets." Henderson droned. He read through clauses about debts and funeral expenses. I watched a water stain on the ceiling. Regarding the primary residence, located at 4500 Tuxedo Road in Buckhead, Atlanta. My ears perked up. That was my home. And the vacation property located at 712 Lakeview Drive, Lake Lanier, Georgia. The house I had spent summers decorating, along with the entirety of my stock portfolio, brokerage accounts, and the controlling shares of Vance Designs, LLC. The lawyer paused, looked over his glasses, and continued, I bequeath all listed assets in their entirety to my dear friend and trusted partner, Miss Monique Cross. The words did not register at first. They just hung in the stale air, meaningless. I must have misheard. I turned to look at Marcus Jr., expecting to see confusion, outrage. He did not move. He did not even blink. He just stared at the legal pad. And in his stillness, I found the truth. He already knew. Monique, beside him, finally made a sound. She let out a soft, theatrical sniffle and brought a handkerchief to her eye, a perfect performance of surprised sorrow. What about, I started, my voice a dry whisper I did not recognize. What about me? His wife? Mr. Henderson flipped a page, scanning. Ah, yes, here we are. To my son, Marcus Vance Jr., I leave my personal effects, my watches and cufflinks. He scanned the rest of the page. He frowned, then looked at me with a flicker of pity. Mrs. Vance, he said, I am afraid. That is the extent of the will. The room was utterly silent. No, not silent. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a high-pitched whine. 40 years. 40 years of building his name, his home, his company. 40 years of sacrificing my own career. And in the end, I was worth less than a pair of cufflinks. I was left with nothing, not a single dollar. I kept my gaze locked on my son, begging him with my eyes to look at me, to say something, to fix this. He just stared forward. Then I saw it. A small movement. Monique Cross slowly reached out and placed her hand on my son's arm, rubbing it gently. A gesture of comfort. A gesture of ownership. The lawyer, Henderson, was already packing his briefcase, eager to be done with the discomfort. Monique stood up, dabbing her eyes one last time before slipping the handkerchief back into her expensive purse. I did not move. I could not feel my legs. Marcus Jr. finally pushed his chair back. The sound of it scraping against the wood floor jolted me back. Marcus, I said. My voice was hoarse. He walked past me, heading for the door, holding it open for Monique. I forced myself to stand. I followed them out into the dim, sterile hallway. The elevator doors at the far end were closing. Marcus, I said, louder this time. He stopped, his back to me. Monique stopped with him, turning to face me with a look of feigned patience. You knew, I said. It was not a question. It was the sound of my world cracking down the middle. You sat at that table and you knew. He turned around slowly. His face, the face I had memorized from the moment he was born, was cold. He looked at me as if I were the stranger. It was Dad's decision, he said, his voice flat. He left me with nothing. My voice cracked, echoing in the empty hall. 40 years, Marcus. I'm your mother. He left me homeless. Monique stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. Eleonora, please, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. This is hard on all of us. Marcus Sr. was a complicated man. You, I snapped, pointing a trembling finger at her. You stay out of this. I looked back at my son. She has been poisoning you. You knew about this. You let him do this. He pulled his arm free from Monique's grasp, but not to defend me. He stepped toward me, his eyes hard. He had his reasons, Mom, he said, his voice low and sharp. Reasons? I whispered, the words strangling me. What reasons justify this? Monique? She understood him, he said, glancing back at her. She did not question him all the time. She did not argue with him about the business. She supported him. The blood drained from my face. Argue with him? I said, incredulous. I was his partner. I was the one who kept that business from collapsing. The things I questioned were the things that could have ruined him. He shook his head, a look of profound, patronizing disappointment on his face. You were just difficult, Mom. You were always so strong, so independent. You did not need him. And she did, I finished for him. He did not deny it. The silence was his confession. He was not just accepting this, he was defending it. He believed it. In his mind, my strength was a sin, and her predatory weakness was a virtue. I looked at him, really looked at him. This was not the boy I raised. This was a man I did not know at all. So that is it, I said, my voice dropping, the anger replaced by a terrifying cold clarity. You have chosen her. You have chosen your father's mistress over your own mother. Marcus Jr.'s face hardened. He did not answer. He simply said, I am just respecting my father's final wishes. You should try to do the same. He turned his back on me. He walked over to Monique, and this time he put his arm protectively around her shoulder. He guided her to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood there, shielding her with his body as if I were the threat. The doors opened. They stepped in. Marcus Jr. looked at me one last time, his eyes empty of all the love I had poured into him. The door slid shut, leaving me completely and utterly alone in the dusty hallway. The betrayal was absolute. I do not know how long I stood there after the elevator doors closed. The hallway felt like a tomb. I walked out of the building into the harsh Atlanta sunlight. The noise of the street, the traffic, the people talking felt painfully normal. My world had just ended, and the city had not even noticed. I had my handbag and the clothes I was wearing. The keys in my pocket were useless. The locks on my home, my life, had been changed. I could not go to a hotel. I could not think. My feet just moved. I must have taken a cab. An hour later, I was standing on the familiar tree-lined street in Buckhead. I did not go to my house. I could not. Instead, I walked across the street, up the cracked walkway to the one place that still felt like solid ground. Mrs. Bessie was on her front porch, exactly as I knew she would be. She was in her late 70s, sharp as a tack, wearing a gardening apron and methodically pruning her prize-winning roses. She saw everything on this street. She looked up as my shadow fell across her steps. Her shears paused mid-snip. "Eleonora," she said, her voice dropping its usual cheerful lilt. She squinted at me, taking in my pale face and the 1,000-mile stare. "Good Lord, child," she said, pulling off her gloves. "You look like you have seen a ghost. Sit down. Sit down before you fall." She guided me to the old porch swing, which groaned in protest. I sat, but I did not swing. I just stared at my own house across the street. A beautiful brick prison I could no longer enter. Mrs. Bessie disappeared inside and came back a moment later with 2 tall glasses of iced sweet tea, the condensation already beating on the glass. She handed me one. My hand was shaking so badly the ice rattled. "Now you tell me what has happened," she said, sitting in her wicker rocker. "And do not you dare leave out the parts you think I should not hear." My voice was flat, empty. I told her. The funeral, Marcus Jr.'s speech, the lawyer's office, the will. "He left it all to her, Mrs. Bessie," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Everything. 40 years, and he left me nothing but the clothes on my back. He gave my home to Monique Cross." Mrs. Bessie was silent for a long moment, not a comforting silence, but a heavy one. She took a slow sip of her tea. She did not look shocked. She looked angry. "Honey," she said, setting her glass down with a firm thud. "I'm going to tell you something, and you are not going to like it. But you need to hear it." She leaned forward, her eyes locking on mine. That woman was not a secret. She was a routine. The air stilled. What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been watching that woman come and go from your house for at least 15 years, Eleonora." My heart stopped. "No," I said. "No, she was his assistant. They worked late." "At 2 p.m. on a Saturday?" Mrs. Bessie scoffed. "She was not his assistant, child. She was his other wife." She pointed a wrinkled finger at my house. "He used to bring her round whenever you would go visit your sister up in Augusta. You would be gone 2 days, and her car would be in your driveway by sundown." My mind reeled, grasping for a memory that made sense. But the neighbors, Marcus Jr., we all saw it. Lord forgive us, we just figured you knew. We thought it was one of those arrangements. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping. "I remember one Christmas. Must have been 10, 12 years ago. You were laid up with that terrible flu, just could not get out of bed." I froze. I remembered it vividly. I had been sick for 2 weeks, right before the holidays. "Marcus told me he had hired a neighborhood boy to help him with the Christmas lights," Mrs. Bessie continued, her voice filled with quiet rage. "It was not no boy, Eleonora. I was sitting right here, watching. It was her. She was out there on your lawn, handing him the lights, laughing. And I saw him, he touched the small of her back as they went inside." My breath hitched. I remembered him bringing me soup that night. He had said he was exhausted from doing the lights all by himself. He had kissed my forehead, his lips cool. He had come to me, his wife, sick in bed, right after being with her. The lies were not just about money. The lies were not new. They were old. They were deep. They were woven into the very fabric of the life I thought I had built. Mrs. Bessie let me stay in her guest room. That night, I stared at the ceiling, covered in old-fashioned floral wallpaper. Every word she had said played over and over in my mind. 15 years. The next morning, I could not stay still. Mrs. Bessie was at her church group. I felt a desperate, clawing need to see what they had so brazenly hidden in plain sight. I had no laptop, no iPad. My entire digital life was in that house, on the desk in the study that was no longer mine. I took the bus. The humiliation of it burned. I, Eleanor Vance, who used to co-host the mayor's charity ball, was walking into the Atlanta Public Library, fumbling in my purse for coins to pay for a guest pass. I sat at a scratched terminal, the plastic key sticky beneath my fingers. The woman next to me was watching soap operas on her phone with no headphones. I typed Monique Cross's name into the search bar. Her profile was public. Of course it was. She had nothing to hide. Why would she, when my husband and my son were her shields? The profile picture was of her at the Lake Lanier house, smiling, holding a glass of wine. My wine glasses, the ones I had bought in Italy. The bio read, architectural consultant, lover of jazz and classical music, grateful for life's unexpected blessings. My stomach turned. I clicked on her photo albums. It was my life, stolen and recaptioned. There she was, standing in my living room, next to my fireplace, at a Christmas party. The date stamp was 3 years ago. I was in bed with pneumonia. There she was, in the garden, helping Marcus Sr. plant the hydrangeas. He had told me he had hired a professional landscaper. There was a photo of her wearing the expensive cashmere jacket I had given Marcus Sr. for his birthday. It was draped over her shoulders as she sat in his convertible, the wind in her hair. I scrolled faster, my breath catching in my throat. Each click was another small death, another memory hollowed out and stolen. And then I found it. The photo that stopped my heart. It was old. The quality was grainy. The date stamp read, May 2011, over 10 years ago. Marcus Sr., looking younger, happier than I had seen him in years. Monique, tucked under his arm, beaming, and standing next to them, my son. Marcus Jr., barely 20 years old, home from college for the summer. He had a shy, boyish smile, but he was there. His arm was slung around Monique's shoulder, casually, comfortably. They looked like a family, a happy, complete family. Under the photo, a caption, written by Monique. Our little family will be official one day, just waiting for the right time. So proud of our boy. Our boy. I felt the air leave my lungs. The room tilted. The sound of the soap opera next to me faded into a dull roar. This was not a recent betrayal. This was not a late life crisis or a mistake Marcus Jr. had been dragged into. This was a decade-long alliance. A plan. My son had been lying to my face since he was a boy. He had chosen them, celebrated with them, and kept their secret, all while I paid his tuition and worried about his future. I closed the browser, my hand shaking so hard I could barely control the mouse. The humiliation was gone. The grief was gone. All that was left was a cold, hard, clarifying rage. I walked out of the library and did not go back to Mrs. Bessie's. I could not. I could not sit on that porch and look at that house, knowing what I knew. I used the last of the cash in my wallet to check into a cheap motel off the highway, the kind with flickering neon signs and plastic-wrapped cups. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old cigarettes. It was the first time I had been truly alone in 40 years. I sat on the edge of the stiff, scratchy bedspread. The photo of my son, our boy, burned in my mind. This was no longer about a broken heart. It was no longer about a cheating husband or a disloyal son. This was about theft. A cold, calculated decade-long conspiracy to steal my life. My grief had burned away, leaving something else in its place. Something hard and cold. My 40 years of being Mrs. Vance had been a lie. But before I was Mrs. Vance, I was Eleanor Hayes. And she knew how to balance a spreadsheet. She knew how to follow the money. I pulled out my old flip phone, the one I kept for emergencies. I scrolled through a short list of numbers I knew by heart. I stopped at one name, Rosalind Roz Hayes. No relation, but she was the only person from my old firm I had kept in touch with. She was the best forensic accountant in Atlanta. We had been a formidable team a lifetime ago. She was semi-retired now, but her mind was as sharp as broken glass. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice just as brisk and energetic as I remembered. Eleanor Vance, she boomed. My goodness, I heard about Marcus. I have been meaning to call, honey. How are you holding up? I am not, Roz, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I need your help. Not as a friend. I need the old you. There was a pause on the line. The energy in her voice shifted. Tell me. Marcus did not just leave me nothing, Roz, I said, staring at the peeling paint on the motel wall. I think he stole from me for years to give to his mistress. I think he was moving money, and I think he used the company to do it. Another silence. This one longer, electric. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. A shell company, she finally said. That is what I'm thinking, I replied. And the mistress? Monique Cross. She was his assistant. Now she is the owner of Vance Designs. Roz let out a low whistle. He was not just messy, Ella. He was arrogant. Can you look? I asked. Can I look? She scoffed. If he was moving money, he left a trail. These men always do. They think they are geniuses, but they are just predictable. What do you need? I asked. Give me 48 hours and the company's public tax ID. I have still got my old access to the state registry. If he set up a shell, I will find it. I gave her the number. You do realize, Roz said, her voice turning serious. You are not just looking for an affair, Ella. You are looking for a crime. I know, I said, my grip tightening on the small phone. That is exactly what I'm counting on. We hung up. I lay back on the lumpy pillow, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The neon sign outside cast a red pulsing glow into the dark room. I did not cry. I did not feel fear. For the first time in my life, I was not just a wife or a mother. I was a woman on a mission, and I was finally thinking like myself again. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life. I stayed in that motel room. I drank bitter, burnt coffee from the machine in the lobby. I watched the clock on the bedside table, each minute stretching into an eternity. I had no appetite. I was running on something colder and stronger than food, adrenaline. My little flip phone sat on the nightstand, a silent black rectangle. I stared at it, waiting for it to ring, my entire future balanced on that one call. On the second night, just after 10 p.m., it vibrated. The screen lit up. Roz Hayes. I snatched it up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Roz. I found it, she said. Her voice was pure steel. No greeting, no small talk. Tell me, I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. It is worse than we thought, Ella, she said, and a whole lot smarter. He was arrogant, but he was not stupid. I heard her typing. He did not just write her checks. He laundered it. He created a shell corporation, registered in Delaware, of course. Untraceable, he thought. A shell company, I repeated, the words feeling right. Yep. Quint Consulting, LLC. Sounds professional, does it not? Except it has no office, no employees, no website. Its business address is a P.O. box in a strip mall. My breath caught. And the owner? Guess, Roz said, her voice dry. Monique Cross. Bingo. Sole proprietor. The company was incorporated 11 years ago, right around the time Mrs. Bessie said she started seeing her at your house. I felt a cold wave of nausea. This was the plan. The long, patient, evil plan. But the money, Roz, I pressed. How did he move it? That is the genius part, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. He did not move one big lump sum. He bled his own company dry, drop by drop. I listened. My mind, the old financial consultant's mind, snapping into focus. Vance Designs, Roz explained, has a discretionary budget for outside consulting. Every quarter, for 11 years, Marcus Sr. authorized a payment to Quinte, consulting for design services or project advisement. Invoices, I whispered. He created fake invoices. Exactly. Small enough to fly under the audit radar. 10,000 here, 15,000 there. But it adds up, Ella. I waited. I needed the number. I've only gone through the last 5 years of bank records, Roz said. In just that time, he consulted her to the tune of over $350,000. The room spun. $350,000. The house, I said, my voice barely audible. What about it? The Lake Lanier house. He bought it 6 years ago. The down payment, it would have been. Right around the time the payments to Quint Consulting suddenly got bigger. Roz finished for me. The phone was silent for a moment as the weight of it settled on me. This was the weapon. This was the proof. This was not a gift. This was not an affair. This was corporate fraud. This was a crime. Roz, I said, my voice shaking, but not with sadness, with rage. He did not just give her that house at Lake Lanier. No, honey. Roz's voice came through the line, cold and clear. He used stolen company money to buy it for her. The next morning, I was a different woman. My grief was gone, burned away by the cold, clean fire of the truth. I was not a victim. I was an investigator. Roz emailed me the files, a beautiful, damning spreadsheet, complete with wire transfer codes, dates, and the Delaware registration for Quint Consulting, LLC. I left the motel. I took the bus, not to the library, but to the tallest glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. I did not have an appointment. I did not have any money, but I had the one thing that mattered: leverage. I walked into the lobby of James Wharton and Associates. The air smelled like money and success. The receptionist, a young, sharp woman, looked at me over her glasses. I probably looked like a ghost, worn out, in the same clothes as the day before. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but skeptical. "I'm here to see Attorney Cynthia James," I said, my voice steady. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but you will tell her that Eleanora Vance is here. Tell her I have definitive proof of corporate fraud involving Vance Designs." The receptionist's eyebrows shot up. She picked up her phone. 5 minutes later, I was being escorted into a corner office with a panoramic view of the city. Attorney Cynthia James was standing by the window. She was a tall, formidable African-American woman in her 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. She did not come to shake my hand. She just watched me as I walked in. "You look terrible, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice deep and no nonsense. "But you sound determined. You have 10 minutes. "I only need 5, I said. I walked to her desk and placed my flip phone and the printed out email from Roz on her pristine glass desk. "That," I said, "is a shell corporation registered to Monique Cross. And that is a list of fraudulent payments made from my late husband's firm, Vance Designs, to that shell corp over the last 5 years, totaling over $350,000. Cynthia James did not move for a moment. Then slowly, she walked to the desk. She picked up Roz's summary. She read. I watched her eyes, sharp, intelligent, dart across the page. She read it once. Then she read it again, slower. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a lioness that had just caught the scent of her prey. Quint Consulting, she mused. He was not even very creative. She looked up at me, all skepticism gone. They expected you to contest the will, did they not? Fight over the scraps in probate court, argue that he was not of sound mind. I imagine so, I said. Well, we are not going to do that, she said, dropping the papers on her desk. Contesting a will is for grieving widows. You, Mrs. Vance, are a creditor. She walked back to the window, her hands clasped behind her back. This is not a family dispute anymore. This is a federal case. We will not contest the will. Why would we? We will sue Monique Cross directly. For conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, she said. For fraudulent conveyance. We will argue that every dollar transferred to her was a theft. We will not just ask for the will to be overturned. We will demand the return of all stolen assets, plus interest and damages. She turned to face me. This changes everything. The will only gives her what he had, but he did not have this money to give. It was stolen. I finally allowed myself to breathe. There is one more thing, Cynthia said, her gaze intense. The photo you told me about on the phone, your son. My stomach tightened. He knew. Yes, she said, and we will subpoena him. We will put him on the stand and force him to choose under oath whether he was an active conspirator or just a fool. Either way, his testimony will be devastating for Miss Cross. She saw the flicker of pain in my eyes. This will be ugly, Eleanora, she said. using my first name for the first time. They will paint you as a bitter, vengeful woman. Your son will be humiliated. He made his choice, I said, my voice cold. When he defended her, when he left me in that hallway. Cynthia James nodded, a look of grim respect on her face. Good. They expected a victim. They are about to face a fighter. Before we filed the lawsuit, I knew I had to do one last thing. I called Marcus Jr. He answered on the third ring, his voice wary. What? I'm at the coffee shop in Virginia Highland, I said, naming the place I used to take him for hot chocolate after his soccer games. Meet me, half an hour. I do not know if that is a good idea, Mom. Things are complicated. I'm not asking, Marcus, I said, and hung up. I sat in a booth by the window, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of me. The place still smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon. He showed up 20 minutes later. He looked tired, and his expensive suit was wrinkled, as if he had been sleeping in it. He did not look like my son. He looked like a man haunted by his own choices. He slid into the booth opposite me, keeping his distance. He did not order anything. You should not have called me, he said. Monique's lawyer said we should not have contact. So she has lawyers now, I said. Good. She will need them. What do you want, Mom? If this is about the will, I told you, Dad's wishes. This is not about the will, Marcus. I slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was the Delaware registration for Quinte Consulting, LLC, with Monique's name listed as sole proprietor. He glanced at it, confused. I do not know what this is. It is a shell corporation, I said, my voice low and even. Your father set it up 11 years ago. I slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was Roz's summary. Just one page, showing the wire transfers from Vance Designs to Quint. This, I said, is a list of fraudulent payments. Over $350,000. This is how he paid for Monique's house. This is how he paid for her car. This is how he paid for the life he stole from me. Marcus Jr. stared at the papers. His hand, which was resting on the table, began to tremble. This is a crime, Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the cafe's soft jazz music. This is not a love story. This is not about him being understood. This is felony fraud. Your father was a thief. I watched him. I prayed for a flicker of horror, of shame, of the boy I used to know. He looked at the papers. Then he looked at me, and his face hardened. He shoved the papers back across the table, his knuckles white. No, he said, his voice a low growl. I am not doing this. I am not listening to this. You have to, I insisted. She is a criminal. She conspired with him. Stop it, he hissed, slamming his hand on the table. The few other patrons in the cafe looked over. You are just angry you lost, he whispered, leaning in. You cannot stand that he chose someone else. You cannot stand that he was finally happy. I stared at him, my heart turning to ice. He had not even processed the evidence. He had simply, immediately, chosen to protect the lie. He was a criminal, I said, enunciating every word. And what were you? He shot back, his eyes flashing with a cruelty I had never seen. You were just too strong, Mom. You were impossible. You were always right, always correcting him, always managing everything. His voice broke just for a second. You did not need him. He told me that. Mona, she made him feel needed. She made him feel like a man. And you made him feel like a project, he finished, his words landing like a physical blow. That was it. The last thread of hope, the small foolish part of me that thought my son was still in there, finally snapped. I looked at him, at this stranger who wore my son's face. You are right, I said, my voice suddenly calm. The storm inside me had passed. I was too strong. I was strong enough to build his company. I was strong enough to raise you. And I am strong enough to take back what is mine. I stood up, leaving the coffee, leaving the papers, leaving him. You are just doing this to destroy his memory, he called after me, his voice rising in desperation. I stopped at the door. I turned to look at him one last time. No, Marcus, I said. I am doing this to reclaim mine. I walked out the door and never looked back. The battle line was drawn. The day attorney Cynthia James filed the lawsuit, the shockwave was immediate. We had not challenged the will in probate court. We had bypassed it entirely and filed in a civil court, Vance versus Cross. The charges were conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, fraudulent conveyance, and unjust enrichment. We were not asking for the will to be changed. We were accusing Monique Cross of being a criminal. The summons was served to her at the Buckhead Mansion, my house. I heard from Mrs. Bessie that Monique had to sign for it herself, right on the front porch she now thought was hers. They were completely blindsided. They had prepared for a family drama, a tearful, messy fight over who Marcus Sr. loved more. They had their speeches ready about his final wishes. They were not prepared for a forensic accountant and a federal fraud case. The reaction was swift. Marcus Jr., using his own significant salary and whatever was left in the personal accounts, hired one of the most expensive and ruthless corporate law firms in Atlanta to represent Monique. Within a week, their counterattack came. It was not a denial of the relationship. It was a full-throated defense of the business. They produced the fake invoices, dozens of them, all neatly printed on Quinte Consulting, LLC, letterhead. They were for strategic design futuring, market analysis, and confidential project sourcing. They painted me as the bitter, grieving widow, the scorned wife who was uninvolved in the business and was now trying to tarnish her late husband's impeccable memory out of spite. Their lawyers gave a statement to the Atlanta Business Journal, calling my lawsuit a frivolous and desperate attempt to circumvent a legal and binding will. But that was just the public smear campaign. The real attack was legal. Cynthia called me. Her voice was all business. They have filed a motion to dismiss, she said. What does that mean? I asked, pacing the small motel room. It is their first strike weapon, she explained. They are not arguing the facts of the fraud, not yet. They are arguing that you do not even have the right to bring the case. My blood ran cold. How? It is a classic lack of standing argument, Cynthia said. They are claiming that Eleanor Vance was not an employee, not a shareholder, and not an officer of Vance Designs. Therefore, you have no legal standing to sue on behalf of the company. I sank onto the bed. But the money was stolen. They are arguing that even if it was, which they deny, it was stolen from the company. And since Monique Cross now owns the company, thanks to the will, it is an internal matter for her to resolve. They are essentially saying the company stole from itself, and it is none of your business. A wave of dizziness hit me. It was a brilliant, cold-blooded legal loophole. They were trying to use the very will that was funded by the fraud to protect them from the consequences of that fraud. The judge has set a hearing date for the motion, Cynthia said, her voice grim. What happens at the hearing? I whispered. This is the first battle, Eleonora, and it is the most important one. We will go to court. They will argue you have no standing. We will argue you do. She paused. If we lose this motion, the case is over. It will be dismissed. Monique wins. It will all be over before it even begins. The confidence I had felt just days before evaporated, replaced by a familiar, sickening dread. They were going to get away with it. The courtroom was the same one from my flash forward. The air was just as stale. I sat behind Cynthia James, my back rigid. I was wearing the only decent suit I had taken with me from the house, a navy blue one I had owned for 10 years. Across the aisle, Monique and Marcus Jr. sat behind their high-priced lawyer. Monique looked immaculate, the picture of quiet professionalism. My son looked straight ahead, his jaw tight. He never once looked at me. The judge entered. She was a black woman in her 60s, Judge Althea Rowland. Her face was stern, intelligent, and gave away nothing. Monique's lawyer, a slick man named Barden, stood up. He argued his motion to dismiss with smooth confidence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity, "this is a tragedy, but it is a family tragedy, not a corporate one." "Mrs. Vance," he said, gesturing to me as if I were a child throwing a tantrum, "was a homemaker. She was not involved in Vance Designs." He painted a picture of me as a distant, uninvolved wife who was now lashing out because she was unhappy with a legal will. "She has no standing," he concluded. "She was not an employee. She was not a shareholder. She has no legal right to sue on behalf of a company she was never a part of." Cynthia James sat still, listening, her hands folded. The judge looked at Barden. "I understand your argument, counsel. I would like to hear testimony on this matter. Call your first witness." "We call Ms. Monique Cross to the stand," Barden announced. Monique walked to the stand, her heels clicking decisively. She swore her oath, her voice clear and strong. Barden led her through a carefully rehearsed performance. "Ms. Cross, how long were you with Vance Designs?" 15 years, Monique said, smiling sadly at the judge. "I started as an admin. Marcus, Mr. Vance Sr., he saw my potential. He mentored me." "And these invoices?" Barden said, holding up the stack of fakes. "From Quint Consulting?" "Those were for confidential sourcing trips and market analysis I did," she said, lying as easily as she breathed. "Marcus was planning a major expansion. It was highly sensitive. He paid me for that extra work through my own consultancy." "And Eleanor Vance?" Barden asked, his voice dripping with pity. "Was she involved in these expansion plans?" Monique looked at me, her eyes filled with a perfect false sympathy. "Oh no, Eleonora. She was wonderful, but she was focused on the home, on her charities. She was not interested in the details of the business. She had just painted me as an ignorant housewife, erasing the decades I had spent balancing the company's books with a single, condescending lie." Barden smiled. "Thank you, Miss Cross. No further questions." Then my stomach clenched. "We call Marcus Vance Jr. to the stand," Barden said. My son walked past me, his gaze fixed on the judge. He swore his oath, his hand steady. "Mr. Vance," Barden said, his tone gentle, as if approaching a grieving son, "you were close to both your parents." "Yes, sir," Marcus Jr. said. "To your knowledge, was your mother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, involved in the day-to-day operations of Vance Designs?" I stopped breathing. This was it, the moment he would have to choose under oath. Marcus Jr. looked at his hands. He paused. "No, sir," he said, his voice clear and cold. "My father handled the business. My mother, she was distant. She was uninvolved in that side of his life." The words hit me harder than the will. A direct, calculated lie, under oath, to protect his father's mistress. "Thank you, son," Barden said, almost paternally. No further questions. Barden sat down, looking supremely confident. He had established his narrative. I was the outsider. I had no standing. Cynthia James did not cross-examine them. Not yet. The judge looked over her glasses at my lawyer. "Attorney James, your response?" Cynthia stood up, but she did not look at the witnesses. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Barden is correct about one thing. This is not a simple family dispute, but his client's testimony is irrelevant." The judge frowned. Irrelevant? That is a bold claim, counsel. It is irrelevant, Cynthia continued, because Mrs. Vance's standing here has nothing to do with her being a wife or an employee. It has to do with her being a creditor. Barden let out a small, sharp laugh. A creditor? On what grounds? The judge looked at Cynthia, her patience wearing thin. Counselor, you are making an extraordinary claim. The floor is yours, but you had better have something more than conjecture. Cynthia James stood tall, her presence filling the room. Your Honor, she began, Mr. Barden and his clients have based their entire defense on the idea that my client was just a homemaker. They have lied, under oath, to paint her as an outsider. These are strong accusations, Counselor, Judge Rowland warned. And I have the proof, Cynthia countered. But before I present it, I want the court to understand the foundation. Mrs. Vance's standing comes from the fact that without her, Vance Designs would not exist. She explained how I had used my financial expertise to build the company from scratch. Barden was on his feet instantly. Objection, he snapped. Relevance. What Mrs. Vance claims she did 20 years ago as a wife is not relevant to her standing today. This is a desperate, sentimental ploy. It is not sentiment. It is fact, Cynthia shot back. Where is the proof? Barden sneered. Where is her name on the Articles of Incorporation? Where is her employment contract? A wife supporting her husband's dream is not a legal creditor, Your Honor. It is just a marriage. The judge looked at Cynthia, her expression hardening. She was losing patience. He is right, Counselor, Judge Rowland said, her voice sharp. I appreciate the background, but I am ruling on a motion to dismiss based on legal standing. What I have heard is testimony that your client was not an employee and you have not refuted it. My stomach turned to lead. Cynthia's argument was not working. The core of the issue, the judge continued, leaning forward, is what Mr. Barden first stated. The money, however it was obtained, was taken from the corporation. She fixed her gaze on me, and though her voice was not unkind, her words were devastating. Ms. Vance, while I sympathize with your personal situation, the law is clear. According to the will, which is not being contested here, Ms. Monique Cross is the new legal owner of that corporation. The room went quiet. I could hear Monique let out a small, satisfied sigh. Therefore, the judge said, her voice resonating, any funds taken from the corporation were taken from an entity she now owns. It appears you have no legal claim. It is a matter for her and the company's internal board. I felt the floor drop out. The legal loophole had worked. He had stolen the money and then used his will to give the victim, the company, to his co-conspirator. Across the aisle, I saw it. The triumphant smile. Monique's mask of grief was gone. She looked at me, her eyes glittering with victory. She then looked at Marcus Jr., and he gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible, smug nod. They had won. They had gotten away with it all. My son had lied under oath, and he had won. I felt Cynthia James's hand rest on my shoulder, a silent, heavy acknowledgement of our defeat. The judge picked up her gavel. Attorney James, she said, her voice final, this is a court of law, not sentiment. Unless you have a countersigned loan agreement or some other proof of this alleged debt you mentioned. She lifted the gavel. I am prepared to grant the motion to dismiss. My hope was gone. I stared at the floor, waiting for the sound of the gavel to end my life. The judge's gavel was raised, poised to strike. The sound of Monique's smug sigh echoed in the silence. Attorney James, Judge Rowland said, her voice final. I am waiting. Cynthia James, who had been standing silently beside me, smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a razor's edge. You are correct, Your Honor, Cynthia said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. A wife supporting her husband is just a marriage, but a creditor providing a bailout is a legal binding debt. She turned and walked to her briefcase. Barden, Monique's lawyer, let out an exasperated sigh as if this were a waste of time. And you have this proof? The judge asked, her hand still on the gavel. I do, Your Honor, Cynthia said. She pulled out a thin file. One final piece of evidence. She placed a document on the overhead projector, a bank statement. This, Cynthia said, her voice booming in the quiet room, is a brokerage account statement for Eleanora Hayes, my client, dated October 2008. It shows the liquidation of her entire premarital stock portfolio, an inheritance from her late father, totaling $500,000. Barden was already on his feet. Objection. This is irrelevant. This is her personal ancient history. It becomes relevant, Cynthia said, cutting him off as she placed a second document on the projector. With this. The new image was a wire transfer confirmation from Eleanora Hayes' brokerage account directly into the corporate checking account of Vance Designs, LLC, dated 2 days after the stock sale. When the 2008 financial crash hit, Cynthia announced to the courtroom, Vance Designs was 3 weeks from bankruptcy. Marcus Vance Sr. was about to lose everything. The only reason this company survived? The only reason Ms. Cross has a company to inherit is this $500,000 emergency cash infusion. She paused, letting the image sink in. This was not a gift, Your Honor. This was a bailout. It was not a wife's support. It was an unsecured loan that was never repaid. She turned and looked directly at me, then back at the judge. This did not just make her a wife. It made her the company's primary, largest, and only creditor. She has more standing than anyone in this room. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Barden was speechless, his mouth open. Monique's face had gone pale, her mask of confidence cracking. My son, Marcus Jr., was staring at the screen, his face a picture of dawning, sickening horror. He had never known. His father had built his entire legacy on a lie and on my money. Judge Rowland slowly lowered her hand from the gavel. She took off her glasses and stared at the documents. She looked at Barden, who was sputtering. Mr. Barden, the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. You based your entire motion on the claim that my client was an outsider. Your witnesses lied under oath to support that claim. This evidence proves she was, in fact, the foundation of the company. This is an ambush, Your Honor, Barden stammered. We have not had time to... An ambush? Judge Rowland's voice rose, losing its judicial calm and filling with a cold, righteous anger. You brought a motion to dismiss. My job is to determine standing. Attorney James has just proven standing, beyond a shadow of a doubt. She slammed her hand on the desk, not with the gavel, but with her open palm. The thud made Marcus Jr. jump. The motion to dismiss is denied. Monique let out a small, strangled cry. Furthermore, the judge continued, her eyes blazing, in light of this evidence and the undisputed evidence of fraudulent conveyance to Quint Consulting. She looked at Barden. Counselor, I am granting a summary judgment in favor of the plaintiff. This court finds that Ms. Monique Cross did, in fact, conspire to defraud the company's primary creditor, Ms. Eleanora Vance. The judge looked at Monique, her face a mask of stone. This court orders you to pay back everything. The full $350,000, she said, plus the initial $500,000 debt, plus compounded interest and all legal fees. A judgment in excess of $1 million. Monique shrieked, a high-pitched, ugly sound of disbelief. Marcus Jr. just stared, his face white. He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with the full, devastating weight of the truth. I did not smile. I did not cry. I just stood up. Justice finally served. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The judgment was an ironclad lien against everything Monique Cross owned. She could not sell. She could not transfer. She could not hide. She was forced into a court-ordered sale of the Buckhead mansion. My home. I did not go to the auction. Mrs. Bessie told me it was bought by a young tech mogul who planned to gut the entire interior. I felt nothing but relief. Next went the Lake Lanier house. Then her car. Then her accounts were seized. Everything she had spent 15 years scheming to acquire was liquidated to satisfy the $1 million judgment. Her name, once whispered with envy in Atlanta's social circles, was now synonymous with fraud. She was a pariah. I never saw her again. Justice, when it finally came, was not loud. It was quiet, thorough, and absolute. I did not use the money to buy back the past. That house, that life, it was a museum of lies. It was a cage I had finally escaped. Instead, I took that money, my father's inheritance, the money I had now earned twice over, and I invested in the only person I knew I could trust, myself. I opened Vance and Associates. At first, I hesitated on the name, but Cynthia James convinced me. Take that name, Eleonora, she had said, the name he tried to tarnish, and you make it stand for integrity. So I did. My office is in a new glass tower downtown. It is smaller than the one Marcus Sr. had, but the view of the city is all mine. My clients are not corporate giants. They are women. Women who are planning their futures. Women who need their own legacies secured. I build financial fortresses for them. Fortresses that no man, no child, no secret mistress can ever tear down. 3 years passed without a single word from my son. I heard through the grapevine that he had lost his engineering job. He had spent his savings on Monique's lawyers, but it was the perjury that ruined him. His complicity in the lies had followed him. He was unemployable. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, my assistant buzzed me. "A Mr. Vance is in the lobby to see you. He does not have an appointment." My heart did not leap. It just braced itself. Send him in. He stood in my office doorway. This was not the cold, arrogant man from the courtroom. This man was thin. He was humbled. His suit was cheap. He did not speak. He just looked at me, at the name on my wall, at the life I had built without him. "Mom," he finally whispered, and the tears that I had never shed, he shed for me. He broke down. He told me everything. How his father had poisoned his mind against me for a decade, feeding him a narrative of the difficult, cold mother and the warm, understanding partner. He had been so desperate for his father's approval that he chose to believe the lie. "I was defending an illusion, Mom," he said, his voice raw and shaking. "He was a fantasy, and I destroyed the only real thing I ever had. I destroyed you." I did not go to him. I did not rush to comfort him. I let him stand there and feel the full, crushing weight of his choices. I looked at this broken man who was my son. "Yes, you did," I said, my voice not unkind but firm. "And now you have to rebuild, just like I did." That was 2 years ago. It was not instant forgiveness. It was not a movie. It was slow. It was hard. We started with coffee, once a month, then dinner. He got a new job, a humbler one. He started therapy. He started for the first time in his life to see me as Eleonora, not just as his mother. Tonight, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The city lights glittered like scattered diamonds. My desk was clear. My bank account was full. My name was on the door. My son and I are having dinner on Sunday. The woman who walked out of that courtroom was not a widow. She was not a victim. She was not just a scorned wife or a betrayed mother. I was Eleanor Hayes Vance. I had survived the fire. I had lost my marriage. I had lost my home. I had lost the son I knew, but I had found myself. And I was finally completely free. The woman I was forced to be may be gone, but her strength and her truth still lives on through in the new company I built and the women I now help. Thank you, my dear friends, for walking this road with me. If this story touched your heart, I would truly love to hear from you. Tell me, what city or country are you listening from, dear? Rate this story from 0 to 10, so I can see how far reclaiming your own name can travel. Feels like sitting on the porch with family, just heart to heart. May peace and clarity be with you, always.